Thanks for joining us on the Gentleman Project podcast today. I'm Kirk Chugg.
And I'm Corey Moore. Today, we have a good friend of mine, Jay Francis, in the studio. And Jay and I have actually known each other quite a while. And I've always respected him and looked up to him and certainly thought of him as a gentleman. He's amazing at building relationships and certainly has a background of very prestigious roles that he's played in his life. And I'm sure he would say the most important is a father and husband. But Jay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Corey. It's an honor to be asked. And well, I think about the years that we've known each other. And I can't, I think of golf and jazz and Glenn Wild. So I got to tell you, the first Uncrustable sandwich I ever had was golfing with you at Glen Wild. I mean,
that's taking
it's
luxury to a whole new level.
Peanut butter and jam sandwich.
There's something about
Glen
those
Wild
sandwiches. I don't know what it is. They're so good, especially on the golf course.
Anyway,
those are all great things. I like this. We're golf, Glen Wild, jazz, all very that I like.
All very Corey things. Yes. No wonder you guys are such good friends.
Yes.
Jay, help everybody who's listening get to know you a little bit.
I worked for 35 years for the Larry Miller Group, and I retired in May of 2020 during the height of the pandemic. I was handling all the philanthropy, and Gail Miller and I had been talking about retirement, and she called one morning and said, maybe now's good, because she thought that maybe philanthropy was going to dry up because we may have to use the money to save the company and save people's jobs. And it was a good time. I started with the Jazz in 1983. Sam Battistone, I was doing marketing for him from an ad agency, and he was going to move 12 games to Las Vegas. There's not very many people out there that are alive that know that, but and so he needed a new marketing director, and he asked me if I'd come in-house. And then he hired Dave Checketts 2 months after that, and that just started it. Larry bought the first half of the team in 85, and then the second half in 86. That started a 35-year career with the Larry Miller Group, and I went to the corporate office in 2008 to be executive vice president of operations, and then kind of morphed over to running the real estate and then the philanthropy.
Wow.
It's not very storied. It's been a long term in one place, but I get asked, how did you spend so long? It was 22, 23 years at the Jazz. And of course today, our younger employees, they're not staying. They move, and so we have to look at resumes differently today. But for me, it was like every 5 years there was something that was changing. We added Larry, and then we started doing the arena, and then that came with suites, and that came with the Jazz 100 Club, and so there was always something changing, and the naming rights for the Delta Center back then, and so it wasn't like I was at the same drudgery company for 23 years. And then the corporate office, of course, there was always some things going on there. But so it was changing. It was like I was doing something new every 4 or 5 years, which was good for me, and it kept me in a great organization.
And you stayed local that whole time. So you raised your family here?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Bountiful, and one of those few that moved, and we lived south ever since, in West Jordan and South Jordan, and we've raised our family out in the southwest part of the valley. But most Bountiful kids, they either stay in Bountiful or Centerville, Farmington. All of my siblings live in Farmington, Kaysville, Layton. I'm sort of the lone. No, I have a sister in Panguitch, but
that's a whole nother south.
Oh, so. No, well, she has a passport to get in and out of there. So.
Tell us a little bit about your family and your kids, how many kids you have, what that was like raising a family.
Leanne and I were high school sweethearts. I went on the LDS mission, and I tell everybody I had to get married, and that raises their eyebrows. And I said, no. She was here when I got back, so I had to marry her. But I got engaged 10 days after I got home from my mission, and we got married 3 months later. So
wow.
We've known each other for a long time if you go back to high school. We had our first child a year and a half after we were married, then the second one, then the third one, and then there was a 10-year gap. So we had this caboose that came along. But so we have 3 boys and a girl. The girl is in the middle, sort of. I'm sure there's a lot of things I could go back and do differently, but most of my career was with the Jazz, raising the kids, and so I tried to use that as an advantage. I know I took Mark Eaton and Carl Malone, to their school assemblies occasionally, and they got to bring friends, and they got to introduce their friends to some of the teammates, and they got to be cool. One son was playing basketball for high school, and Thurl Bailey came out to a fundraiser. And so we tried to use Dad's work to be able to have them be part of it. It was a lot of hours. I'm going to show a vulnerable side. I always felt like I was less than others. So therefore I felt like I had to work harder than others. And I was usually the first one there at the Delta Center in the morning and late nights. And so 7:30 in the morning, and after a game night, that's 11:30, kind of buttoning things up. But when the kids got older, we used to say, okay, and Leanne would come down with the car and the kids, so we had 2 cars, so we used to paper, rock, scissors, whose turn is it to ride home with Dad? As they got older, you ride with Dad. But no, we took turns so that I could I could ask them about their teachers and their friends and what's going on. And during the 3 years that, when our kids were playing high school sports, I missed more Jazz games during those years than any other time, because you can't get those back. And I had a good staff. I didn't have to be there every game. It was a lot of work and a lot of time away. We would try to do breakfast buddy. We called them breakfast buddies on Saturday mornings, and take one of them and go to, it was called, wasn't Carl's Jr.'s, but it was Hardee's, because it was close.
Yeah, Hardee's.
And, it wasn't healthy, but they still remember it. And because I take my dog now in my Razor every Saturday morning, and he gets an Egg McMuffin, and the kids are jealous. Say, "Oh, Rory's got breakfast buddies now." So the fact that they remembered that it was called breakfast buddies, I hope that it made some difference, and maybe they'll do something similar. So
grandkids now?
13.
13 grandkids.
And some of them we say that we have 13, and some of them by osmosis. There's been a couple of second marriages, and we have, but they're our grandkids, and we treat them just as if they had the same last name. But yeah.
How is it being a grandpa? How do you like that? And how is it different from being a dad?
You can send them home. No, it's being a grandkid, or being a grandfather, and having grandkids is fun. You can be with them, and you can kind of maybe teach them a little bit, but have fun with them. It's the tough thing is sometimes too, though, is you want to be a father, you want to say something, and it's not your place.
Yeah. And
fortunately, I don't believe I've ever been put back in my place. So but we really be careful about that. But they do things different. Leanne and I'll talk about that. You'll say, well, I guess not how we used to do it, but you have to respect the way they're doing it, and they're doing a great job. But sometimes you put the parent hat on instead of the grandparent hat. But when they leave with a can of soda pop and a candy bar, my daughter-in-laws aren't too happy, and I say, hey, that's what grandpas do. Yeah.
And you get away with that probably pretty well. Yeah.
So as you're teaching these kids lessons as they grow up, and you can kind of look back now, and that part of your life as a father with kids at home has closed, and you're moving on to this grandfather role. What are some of the things that you hope that your kids absorbed while they were home? Some qualities or some lessons that you taught them?
I hope, and I see it, but I probably one of the ones that I was taught by my parents, and that was hard work, or just work. I grew up with not a whole lot. I never went without, but I didn't have the stylish jeans. I remember getting a job earlier than normal, so that I could save some money, and so I could have some of the stylish clothes, because mom and dad couldn't afford it. But boy, I watched my dad work 3 different jobs. He was an accountant, he was selling Cutco knives on the side, and he was doing somebody's books on the weekends. And wow. And then I believe that has helped me in my career. Like I said, I never believed I was the smartest person. And so but I could try to outwork everybody and work harder and do more. And so when Larry Miller said, I need somebody to sell the suites, I got pulled into that because I was willing to work. And I hope that my kids, have learned that same thing. And I hope they didn't feel like that we sacrificed anything. But I'm seeing it, in my new roles in my career today. I interact with a lot more younger business people, and we're losing that a little bit. I don't know. And I think the pandemic hurt us a little bit with that. Having to now work from home. But 9 to 5 clock watchers, that's not my job. That is nothing I have ever said. That's not my job. So I hope that my kids have, and I guess the other thing would be loyalty. Loyalty to who they work for, loyalty to what they believe in. And that'll take them a long ways.
How have you taught your kids loyalty and hard work? Do you have any hows, or was it more through just example of watching you work and be loyal? Do you have any takeaways that the listeners could say, that's something I'd like to try at home?
I wish I did. I think it's probably more from example, and maybe, as they were growing up, they had chores, they had their things they had to do around the yard or around the house. And I know that one of the things I thought about, coming here was, if the question came up, what would you do different? If I rewound the clock, I would maybe be a little bit more formal about sitting down and saying, okay, we need to talk about some values. And I remember when Larry Miller was getting up in age. He never got old because he died at 64, but he could see that he needed to kind of start passing on what's up in his noodle onto his kids. And he pulled them into the boardroom, handed out a yellow pad, and said, "You're going to want to take notes." And then they started meeting, I believe it was like every Friday, and he started telling them how he did business, why he would buy real estate the way he did, why he would buy a dealership, and how he would do financing, et cetera, et cetera. I wish, I didn't have a business to pass on to him, but I wish I would have sat down with him and said, look, okay, let's talk about what our values and what our goals. You talked about goals kind of just in a cursory way, but I wish that had been a little more formal and maybe had a more formal process.
Yeah, and for those who are listening and don't know the background of the Gentleman Project, that's exactly why this was born, is that Kirk was doing that with his boys, and I learned about it. He was doing like True North principles in a journal and teaching one at a time to his boys and journaling about it. And his boys named it the Gentleman Project. And when I heard about that, I thought, I'm not doing anything like that. I'm just, I'm trying to teach them great values, and I'm trying to show them hard work and try to make good decisions. But, that's why this podcast was born, because I was like, oh man, I need to do something like that. And so I started trying to do that with my kids, although I was never as good at it as Kirk was. And now I have my kids listen to the podcast, because they'll listen and I'll pause it, right? Like right after you talked about those things, and I'll say, okay, well, how are we learning hard work, or how are we learning about loyalty? And so there you go. That's why this whole podcast was born.
This has given me a great time to think and maybe some pleasure and some guilt, but we can't go back, but we can try to pass on and teach others to maybe be a little bit better. And I've talked to my kids about that, especially my sons, because they have opportunities, and their kids are still young. So, yeah.
And when you talk about that, where there's some pleasure and some guilt when you reminisce about your journey as a father with kids at home, we hope that anybody listening that has those tinges of guilt or my time has slipped away and I've squandered the opportunity, can get past that. And if this podcast ever made anybody feel guilty, that's not the intent. It's the intent is that we look forward every day for the opportunity to learn something new and to pass on those things to somebody. They may not be your children. They may be kids in your neighborhood that walk across your lawn.
Right.
They may be kids in your congregation. They may be kids in your scout troop. They may be kids on your other kids' sports teams. Find those opportunities to leave your mark, and guilt's never going to get you anywhere. And so again, reiterating to everybody listening, the podcast shouldn't make you feel guilty.
No, not at all.
No.
And I want to thank Jay for being vulnerable enough to say, well, I did look back and ask myself, what would I do a little bit different? And you know, you've been an amazing father because I know your kids. And especially in balancing this fairly rigorous, big time job you had for a whole career and spending time with your kids and doing the breakfast buddies things and the many other things that you did. But a lot of times people don't want to talk about, hey, you know, I wish I would have done things a little different. I have a ton of those. I have a ton of things where I'm like, oh man, my kids are, you know, my oldest is 16, my youngest is 9. And I still think to myself, man, what if I would have done this with my 16-year-old that I'm doing with my 9-year-old now? It would have been better. But to your point, Kirk, I don't think that's helpful in any way. You know, they always say, what's the best time to plant a tree? 10 years ago. When's the second best time? Today. Right. And so I think for those listening, the point is, the reason we talk about these is it can just be one little thing. Maybe you now do breakfast buddies and that's it. Well, that's huge. You know, if you did that one thing, that could change everything. You know, I've got about 100 things that we talked about on the podcast, and I couldn't even do all the things that have been talked about, but there's 3 or 4 or 5 things that I've implemented because I've heard and I've thought, and it's changed. It's made me inch towards being a little bit better, you know? So that's the whole point.
Yeah. I look at what we've been doing as a family, and a lot of it and a lot of the culture that we now have has come from conversations in the last 2 years of ideas that our guests have given me that we've then taken and implemented in our family. And here's what I hope happens. I hope that one family hears one idea, and that makes a stronger relationship between a parent and a child, or a grandparent and a child. And that relationship and that growth of that relationship is worth every effort of the podcast. And it's worth every effort of every one of our guests who's taken the time out of their day to come in and talk. So we're really doing this for the listeners. If you're listening to this today and think we're doing this out of ego in some way, this is 100% so that those butterfly effects can happen. We've also said selfishly, we get a whole lot out of this thing too. So
you've talked about some of these things that you've taught your kids about hard work and loyalty in multiple ways. Talk to us about, are there any books or things you've asked your kids to read or would love for them to read that would help them in their life? Well,
there's 2. One is so old that you probably can't find it, but is Dress for Success, and it still has the right principles.
Yeah, it's more than about clothes, right?
No, it is. It's how you feel. Here I am today in a white shirt because I knew I was coming to see Corey Moore, in my cashmere jacket. But you know, yesterday may have been a golf shirt and Levi's because I was going to be in the office all day. But you feel different. And if I'd gotten a call from the front desk that said, "Hey, Gail Miller's here to meet with you," I would have felt unprepared. So dressing for success is not just about how to tie the Windsor knot, although it teaches you that, but it's about how it makes you feel and how it makes your behavior. So even though it's ancient in its history, I think it still has some principles. The other one is Larry's book, Driven. And if I was a business professor, it would be required. It is so open, so honest about about him as an individual, about principles. it just is, it's about fatherhood. It's about business. It's about mistakes I made. It's about setting goals. And he's very, very vulnerable.
What would you say are the big things you learned from him? Because I know he had, especially later in his life, he talked a lot about family and balancing work and family and principles in business. So, you know, you were pretty close to him and the Miller family for a long time. What kind of things did you learn from them that have affected you in your life?
Well, we've already talked about hard work, but Larry was, you know, the epitome of that. I learned how to delegate because he didn't know how to. I mean, I seriously, I learned from some of his shortcomings, and he admitted, you know, that delegation wasn't one of his strengths, and he was hands-on. I learned loyalty was huge. He has a chapter in his book about loyalty, and I'm honored to be mentioned in that chapter. I learned from him that doing a deal and doing a fair deal is more important than getting the deal done. And he has said, every time I buy or sell a business, I know I can walk down the street and look somebody in the eye and not have to look the other way. There were times when, you know, we would be saying, Larry, we can do better than that. And he'd say, no, this is better. I learned a lot from him. And it was because of him that, you know, Leanne and I got an opportunity to serve as a mission president for 3 years. I was still an employee, $400 a month, and I was Larry's consultant. But he also paid for insurance and life insurance, health insurance, and put a nickel in the 401k to keep it open. And then he told the payroll, he said, gross it up so that he can have $200 a month to take Leanne out to dinner. So I was Larry's consultant for 3 years, and we talked about quarterly. You know, he'd call. So, and it goes back to that loyalty thing. He and I talked. We had some really personal talks, and we talked one time about family, and then about, you know, you sacrificed a lot to build this dynasty. Without it, we wouldn't have the Jazz. They would have been in Minnesota. Without it, the state would really have a different complexion. But you've also talked about, you know, your family paid some prices for that. And he said it was almost like a nightmare to him because yes, but, and but his family has grown from it. With his honesty, before he passed, Greg and Steve and the others have been able to take from that and do some things differently. He went home and would download to Gail, and we didn't know that. All those years, and Gail. So when Gail stepped into the chair and she started speaking, I think some of us that had been around for a long time kind of rolled our chair back around that board table and said, "Whoa, we're in good hands." And
yeah, she seems extremely competent and sharp and on top of things in a big way.
She is, well, and that a lot of that has, you know, she has grown since, you know, 2019 February 2019 is when he passed away.
Yeah.
But she's become, you know, a state leader.
Oh yeah. Yeah. She really has. So talk to us a little bit about your growing up and some of the things that your parents taught you that, you know, that have made you who you are, and maybe others that have affected your life, you know, other mentors in your life that have helped you in addition to Larry, that have made you who you are.
We didn't grow up with much. Fortunately, I always lived in a home. I guess I lived in an apartment for a year. I don't remember that, but I've always lived in a home. It was the same home in Bountiful, Utah. It's interesting. I've been asking Mom a lot of questions. She's still alive, 91. We lost Dad 2 years ago next week. He was 94. But because the house today is 3 bedrooms, 4 downstairs, and there were 6 kids. And I remember finishing the bedroom downstairs, and I got it. And I said, "Where did everybody sleep?" I guess I just didn't pay attention to that. We were fine. We were going, but I remember as I got older, you know, patches on the pants, which wasn't cool. Today, I was in style, but only 60 years too early. So, but, I learned work, and they encouraged me to go mow lawns. And I was working up on, Leon Brown Floral owned all the hillside of Bountiful, where Bountiful Golf Course is now in Maple Hills. It was all orchards and flowers, and I was weeding. And I've already confessed this to the right people, but I lied to get a job. I was only 13, but I told them I was 14. But I needed a job. And I worked for Charlie Bangler out in Centerville. I rode my bike from 1800 South over to Centerville and picked radishes from 7:30 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon and rode back. So those are the things that, I didn't grow up on a farm. You hear all these people say, well, I grew up on a farm and had to get up and milk the cows. And sometimes you say, God, I wish I'd have grown up on a farm. But I didn't grow up on a farm. The other, there was one other person that really changed my life, and that would be Hugh W. Pinnock, who was my mission president. He was a successful businessman here. At 39 years old, he was called to be a mission president. And I got a chance to work really close with him on my mission as a young man. And my parents will even say, we're so grateful to Hugh Pinnock, and they saved my son. But I wanted to be like Hugh. And I came home and saved my money so I could buy a pen that looked like his and had a briefcase that looked like his. The only thing I ever did, I think, that disappointed him was I didn't want to be a life insurance salesman. As much as he asked me and he encouraged me, but I went a different direction. But I got a chance to watch him. I watched him as a family man. I got to learn about his career, and so to blend those two, the stuff that my parents taught me, and then the business aspect that Hugh taught me. And he was there. We would, even after, for years, he passed away young too at 64, but it was fun to stay in touch with him. And as I would have different opportunities with the jazz, I would go talk to him and say, what do you think? And I would talk to him. There were opportunities for me to leave the jazz and go to Toronto, leave the jazz and go to Miami. And it just it never felt right for me. One of them, Larry brought to me because the owner had contacted him, and so it was. There may have been some better financial opportunities, but what happened here, I can't replace with dollars anyway.
Yeah. Well, when you came in, we were talking about building relationships, which you're really good at, and have lots of them. Talk a little bit to us about the importance of building relationships through your career, what that's meant to you, and maybe a little bit about the how do you build relationships. And then maybe after that, talk a little bit about how does that affect family, right? Because we're really building relationships with our wife over time and our kids over time. So maybe talk about your thoughts as it relates to building relationships.
That's a great question, Corey. It's how I built my career. It's what I guess it's my resume. I think I mentioned to you earlier, maybe off air, I don't have a resume. I've never typed one up. I've never applied for a job. I have a bio. Occasionally people want to use that for something, but and it's just, again, it's through effort and sacrifice. When I was in the ad agency business before the jazz, you had to go get involved. They had something that was called the Ad Club. They had monthly lunches, and everybody was there. The general managers of the radio stations, the TV stations, all the ad agency people are there. Well, if you don't show up, you don't meet the right people. So then I took those relationships when I became vice president of marketing for the Jazz and used those relationships, because Sam Battistone hired me and he said, anything you can do with tickets, you can do. If you need money, we're out of luck. And in fact, Dave Checketts and I, we got asked, and the staff got asked to hold our paycheck more than one time in the early days, because they had to the players' checks needed to clear, and they needed another week.
Wow.
By the way,
incredible.
the player payroll in 1983 was $1.3 million
Total.
Yeah. But so I took those relationships with the relationships from the ad agency, and I'd gotten to know the radio people, and so I would go around with a stack of tickets and go to the Johnson & Johnson radio show or the Fisher and Todd show and the KSL morning show and show up at the studio just like we're sitting here around these mics and would talk about tomorrow night's game. And by the way, fifth caller, we've got 4 tickets for you. Well, that's free publicity. And I got that because of relationships. I didn't have money to be able to buy the ads on the radio, but taking the tickets, it was a win-win. They got to do something for their listeners that nobody else was doing. I got to promote tomorrow night's game or the game 2 nights away. And we just build on that. And then when it came time to start, adding some of the VIP amenities, when we built the Delta Center, some of those relationships were built. And it was interesting. I just on the drive in, I was talking to somebody in the travel industry business because we were talking about a tourism project, and the name Fred Rollins came up. Fred Rollins was with Delta Airlines, and he was a master of building relationships. And through him, through the relationship he and I had, he introduced me to somebody in Atlanta, and we got the Delta Center. But I've gotten to know lots of great people. It's a two-way street, but you can't look at it as what's in it for me, or it's not a relationship. It's a contact.
Yeah,
it's a business deal. And so it has to be more of a sacrifice. And we talked about loyalty. Loyalty has to be part of those relationships. You have to know that you can count on them. And so, as you said, Corey, you can take that over into your family life as well. And I've tried to introduce my family to some of the people that I know. And it was an honor here a few years ago to be honored as Father of the Year, and to be able to have my family there, and to be able to meet some of the people that they've heard me talk about, and for them to be, they know, some of my kids can rattle off some of those, they know they've met Scott Anderson, and they'll tell you that I know Scott Anderson, Zions Bank, or they've met, Rob Bruff, or they've met, some of the different leaders of our community. They even have a picture with, Governor Herbert, at the Father of the Year thing. So trying to get them to be part of that rather than just, staying home with, I remember staying home when Mom and Dad would go out. It was banquet TV dinners, but so.
Well, at least it was probably rubber chicken that you were eating, and
I'm not sure they called it chicken. I'm not sure.
Well, something that you said really resonated with me too. When you have a network of people and you do things like go to those radio shows and ask for some airtime, you had invested into that relationship. And because you had invested into that relationship, when it came time to take a dividend from that relationship capital, they were willing to give it to you because you had already given to them. Most of the time, we expect people to do things for us without any investment into the relationship beforehand. And I think that's the magic in building relationships, is do things just because, go out of your way just because. And because you've done that, down the road, when you need something, you're not going to be asking a favor of somebody. They're just going to be complimenting the relationship like you have already done to them. And if we did business that way, that would change the entire business landscape of our country. If relationships were what transactions were built on.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and even in these last 2 years, I guess I didn't mention it earlier on, but after I retired, I stayed on a couple of boards, one of which was the South Valley Chamber Board, which I chaired it for 5 years and was still on the board. And Greg Summerhays, who I had hired as the chairman, said he was going to go do real estate. And we said, that's great. Can you give us some time to be able to search? And he said, sure, I'm going with my father-in-law, so we got time. And about 30 seconds later, it was really 30 minutes, Rob Bruff and a couple of the other executive, Nate Anderson, And Beth Colosimo called and said, Jay, what are you doing? And so they talked me into running the chamber 2 years ago. But even with that, so 35 years of relationships, I've been able to bring over and to be able to do some new things and get some additional support. But we've really added to what we're doing at the chamber because of relationships. But it's two ways, right? I mean, it's not just me out there with my hands out. We have to deliver, and we have to acknowledge, and we have to give back. And some of that is just small things, remembering somebody. I got a text the other day from somebody, and it was just a one-liner. Wanted you to know I was thinking about you today. Well, that's contacts and relation. That's a relationship, And so it's so important. And as you said, if we could do business that way, wow. I mean, what if the legislature could do that? Okay, I was speechless.
Well, we're going to be careful about where we.
Well, we're running out of time.
No, but I think all of us. When you talk about relationships, I can't help but think about Corporate Alliance, which is now Tribalry and Trust and all that, and all of us have been part of that. And at one time, I remember that we were kind of grading our relationships, meaning, in your mind, do I have a level? I can't remember the levels, but level 1 being not, I barely know them. I know their name. Level 5 is like a pretty good acquaintance. And a level 10 is like a really good best friend. Right. And as we were sitting here, I'm thinking to myself, okay, how would I rate my relationship with my family? Right. Certainly my immediate family, the rest of my family. And then what you would ask yourself when you were with Corporate Alliance, right, is, well, how could I move that needle? Right, where I could have a stronger relationship with each of those people. And I think it would be good for all of us to ask ourselves that. We ask it in business often, right? Because we're trying to do business and we're trying to meet new people and all that kind of stuff. What about your own family? Like, what's my relationship level in my own mind right now with my daughter or with my mom or with my niece, whoever it is, right? It'd be interesting to just kind of think, where is that? And more importantly, probably, what could I do just because they're my family, right? What could I do to increase that relationship? And it's the same principles, right? It's spending time together. It's doing things just because. It's not having any ulterior motive in any way, shape, or form. It's just showing love.
It's right? Breakfast buddies.
It's the breakfast buddies kind of stuff.
It's interesting you say that because I get a lot more calls from my kids just saying, "How you doing, Dad?" Because we had a kind of a family dinner one time, and I said, the only time I hear from you guys is when you want jazz tickets or you want concert tickets or you want and a favor. And it was a little solemn, and I think they thought about it. No, I called you. So, but I get those just because calls, but which puts you on edge because you said, okay, what do you want?
What
now?
do you want?
And it's been good, but and I guess it goes back to some of the things you have to talk about. That you have to talk, and you got to, and it's kind of a tender moment, but we have to work at building those relationships, and we think sometimes that what we do over here in business is important. It is, but if we haven't built it over here, and that's why I say I if I could go back, there's some things I would do, but I've still got time.
Yeah, ditto on this side of the coin. I think too, as I'm thinking about those relationships, especially with family, it's true with any relationship, but especially with family, I think I at least sometimes take those relationships for granted. Well, they know I love them and they know that I care about them. Well,
I go to work every day.
It's easy to
justify. See that I love them.
Yeah, it's easy to not put the emphasis and a plan behind those important relationships because you're family and of course they know, right? But that's not true. I mean, that needs just as much watering as anything else in your life. And quite frankly, as Jay just said, the most amount of watering, right? But I do think that in any of those relationships, this is especially true in a marriage, but it's the same with kids and any relationship. And that is someone always has to be giving more, There's never like a 50-50 equal, right? I mean, it's always someone has to be giving more to the relationship. Someone has to be selfless in the relationship, in any relationship, right? And so if we're constantly creating the habit, like Jay said, of just because type of relationship building, and I don't know if I'll ever need anything from you, but I just like you, and I like people, and I want to have this relationship that may or may not pay dividends someday. Well, great. But in your family, I feel like it's maybe a God-given responsibility to have those kind of relationships. And yet I'm not sure we always put them first, or at least I haven't always put them first. And I'll on air say sorry to my family for like not thinking about each one of those individuals and thinking about how could I do better at building that relationship. And I think we can all say, look in the mirror and say we've been good at that and maybe not so good at that at different times in our life.
Absolutely.
Corey, do you want to ask the question this time?
We're out of time. That's
Can't
crazy.
believe it.
Well, yes. So Jay, we always end the podcast with the same question. And that is, what does it mean to you to be a gentleman?
I think that is just a stellar question. And boy, I'd love to do that with a camera on the street and see what people say. But to me, it means to be respectful, to be kind, and to treat others as you would want them to treat you. You know, often we hear the term gentleman, and I'm, you know, I never walk into an elevator first. Male, female, whoever's standing with me, it's just something about me. And I think it's maybe courtesy too, but boy, kind, respect, and completely honest, because a gentleman is not going to stab you in the back.
Great definition.
Jay, today was the first time I met you, and I'm going to call you a straight up gentleman. Today, even after one interaction with you, I like you.
Thank you. Let's not make this the last.
That's not. I agree. Thank you for joining us, everybody, on the podcast today. We hope that you enjoyed this podcast with Jay Francis. If you would like to connect with him and what he's doing now, because I don't think he's taking retirement very seriously. The South Valley Chamber is where he's involved in the Salt Lake City Valley. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, investing your time with us. Hopefully, if you heard something today that you can implement in your life, in your family, in your friendships, in your relationships, in business, that you'll use that and implement that, and that you've received some value today from the podcast. I'm Kirk Chugg.
And I'm Corey Moore. Go out there and purposefully create more ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for listening.